This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right. Where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. If you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives. With the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. In late January, I had the privilege of speaking for over 90 minutes with Professor Robert George of Princeton University regarding his most recent book, Truth Matters, a dialogue on fruitful disagreement in an age of division. The book comprises a set of 3 dialogues with George's co-author, co-instructor at Princeton, and dear friend Cornel West. George and West are both as well-credentialed as can be. George with a bachelor's from Swarthmore, law degree and master's in theological studies from Harvard, and doctorate from Oxford, not to mention 23 honorary degrees and various awards, including the Presidential Citizens Medal. Dr. West with a bachelor's from Harvard and master's and doctorate from Princeton, plus 20 or so honorary degrees of his own. What makes the relationship interesting is that they are maybe not as far apart on the political spectrum as you can go, but reasonably close. Uh, George is a deep conservative, economically and perhaps especially socially. He is avowedly pro life and literally wrote a or maybe even the book against legalizing gay marriage. There are undoubtedly people who think George is not the sort of person one should have on a podcast. West, on the other hand, might be more progressive than George is conservative. He is identified as a non Marxist socialist, been arrested numerous times at protests over the years, called Joe Biden a war criminal for his actions with respect to Israel and Gaza, and spoken for decades about America as a white supremacist nation. He actually ran for president as an independent candidate this last time around. As with Professor George, there are absolutely people who think Dr. West should not be invited on any podcasts. Perhaps with some luck, he will someday appear on this one. But George and West are great, great friends. They are both serious Christians, George a Catholic and West a Baptist, and deep believers in the virtues of seeking truth and telling truth. They are not afraid of the consequences of making their beliefs known, and they are not afraid of having their beliefs challenged by the very best ideas available. In fact, they seek that out again and again and again, which I'm sure is part of why there's so much demand for their jointly taught course at Princeton. They take students on the sort of intellectual journey most of us never really get to experience. Perhaps what's most interesting about the book, the thing that jumped out most to me, given the chasm between George and West politically, is how often they agree. Politics is just a part of life, and though it can be a big part and certainly can seem like a big part, it's only part. For page after page after page, George and West agree and agree and agree, or at least understand, and extremely well at that. Each of them is frighteningly well read, and they seem to have shared a reading list. This interview came about largely by chance. As background, I've followed both George and West on what is now X for years, and I'm familiar enough with what they look like that, if I saw them in public, I would know who I was looking at. And rewind a little bit to this last September, one sunny Sunday afternoon, and I was walking home. This is back when my wife and son and I still lived in New York City. So walking home, and what do I see? Sitting outside the coffee shop on our block, a dignified man wearing a 3-piece suit and having a cup of tea. It was Professor Robert George. I had one of those, kind of moments where you decide, will you, won't you, introduce yourself. But ended up walking up and introducing myself. And we ended up speaking for about 15 minutes. He was every bit as kind and gracious as you'll hear on the podcast. Gave me his business card. One thing led to another, and here we are. There is a lot on which Professor George and I disagree. We definitely have different views on gay marriage, for one. But he understands his positions and maybe my positions too quite a bit better than I understand probably anything. And even if he didn't change my mind, and he didn't, he definitely gave me cause to think more deeply and read more to understand his position and my own better on that, meaning gay marriage and many other issues. It was a wonderful conversation for which I am grateful. And without further ado, here it is, my conversation with the great Robert George. I understand this is more or less how you dress every day. Is that is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I guess so.
How many suits do you own? How many vests do you own?
That's a good question. I haven't counted.
'Cause this is actually, I think, the nicest I've dressed up not on a Sunday since mid-October when we left New York.
Well, if
Um,
you're blessed with good looks, you don't have to dress up. I've got a lot of stuff.
do you mind me asking how old you were when you started dressing like that?
I can remember that when I was in graduate school at Oxford, so I had finished law school. So let's see, I would have been maybe 25 then or 26.
Mhm.
I started wearing a coat and tie and a sweater because Oxford, even in the warm months, is a little cool. So
Right.
I'd wear a sweater and a tweed jacket and a coat and tie, and that was my daily attire as a graduate student at Oxford. And I had a couple of friends who dressed that way as well. Uh,
Yeah.
and then
I
when
mean,
I
my gosh.
started at Princeton, I dressed in the sort of jacket and coat and tie, except on teaching days. And if I was lecturing, uh, I would um, I would always put on a suit. Uh,
Mm,
it seemed to me to be in line with the dignity of the occasion, the sort of the proper professionalism to wear a suit if you're lecturing about a serious subject matter. But then
right,
if I was teaching a seminar or something like that, I'd go back to a sweater.
right. I want to kind of focus the conversation on 3 areas. First, I'd like to kind of understand your background, like how Professor Robert George became Robert George, starting in West Virginia, and just understand the evolution of your ideas, your ideology. I understand your father was Syrian Orthodox, your mother was a Catholic, and so, to have this,
Hmm.
I think I think it'd be fair to say devout Catholic adult. It's kinda interesting to trace that evolution. And then second, I would love to talk, about the process of making this book. This had to be a fun book to put together.
It really was.
Very a very fun book to put together. And then, so I wanna talk about, some of the ideas that you and Dr. West talk about in there. And then I'd like to get your thoughts on a few issues germane to our current political situation.
Sure.
So, starting from that start, so you were born in Morgantown, West Virginia, which I understand is not a small town, but is a medium-sized town, there in West Virginia. I mean, what was it like growing up there? How does one go from Morgantown, West Virginia, to the academic heights that you've gotten to? Because my guess would be that, um, it wasn't like a huge contingent of your high school is there teaching with you at Princeton.
Well, it is true that I was born and brought up in West Virginia, right on the edge of Morgantown. My mother was born in a little village next to Morgantown called Star City, which was a largely immigrant and coal mining community. We were right on the edge of Morgantown and Star City. Morgantown's where the state university is, and there were, a lot of people who were associated with the university, and then there were people like us who weren't associated with the university and who therefore were, in one way or another, pretty much dependent on the coal economy. Both of my grandfathers were coal miners. My father's father, who was an immigrant from Syria, remained in the coal mines and on the railroads and as a laborer for his entire life until he died of lung disease, which was very typical, of course,
Mhm.
miners in those days from breathing in the coal dust. It was called black lung disease. The
Right.
full name of it is pneumoconiosis. And actually, when I became a lawyer, just out of law school, one of the things I did, some of my first law practice was representing uh, retired miners who were suffering from pneumoconiosis and were therefore eligible for certain benefits from the government for the black lung disease. My mother's father was an immigrant from southern Italy. He began in the mines and was in the mines for 20 years or so.
Mhm.
Then he saved up enough money to open a little grocery store with one of his brothers, and he had a successful little business. I remember both of my grandfathers very well. They were Union men. They were strong Democrats. Uh, I like to say, growing up in West Virginia, we were pretty much like everybody else. I mean, we believed in
Yeah.
four things. We were taught to believe in four things:
Okay.
Jesus Christ,
Okay.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic Party,
Mm-hmm.
and the United Mine Workers of America. And I still believe in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I was gonna
I,
say, I
I
wonder how many
proved it on
people
the
could
other
check
three.
off all four. Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's a
my
yeah.
boyhood really, Nick, was very much a kind of Huck Finn boyhood. I
Yeah.
was the oldest of five, all boys, five brothers, like a
Oh,
basket.
no kidding.
And we grew up hunting and fishing and running around through the woods and through the hills. We're all bluegrass musicians. Are all pretty serious about it. I'm a serious bluegrass banjo player. I continue to this day to be an active bluegrass musician on the banjo.
Nice.
Um, so neither of my parents, of course, had been to college. So I'm what we now call first generation. I'm first generation college.
Mhm.
And the oldest boy, I was the first one to go off to college. I sometimes reflect that the reason I'm not in the coal mines today is probably World War II. Now, I wasn't born until 10 years after World War II had ended, but my father, at age 18 in 1944, hadn't even finished high school. They High school later sent his parents a diploma. He didn't go through a graduation.
No kidding.
He was plucked right out of high school when he turned 18 and sent over to Normandy. Fought in Normandy and Brittany, and then with the occupation army, first in Germany at Nuremberg, actually, where the
Mm.
trials were held, and then in Vienna. And when my father came home from the war, although he didn't have the opportunity to go to college, he did have opportunities outside of going into the coal mines. And he had some skills from the military, which were great. And as a result of that, he didn't end up in the mines. And because he wasn't in the mines, I guess I didn't end up in the mines. Now, both my parents, though not themselves highly educated, had a strong sense that education was very important, and they wanted their boys to be well educated. They wanted their five sons to be well educated. It was just understood from when I was a little boy
Mhm.
that we were going to go to college. That was just the way it is.
Yeah.
Where I grew up, not everybody went to college. A lot of my friends actually didn't end up going to college or completing college. But it was just an understanding we were going to go to college. Now, my parents didn't know a lot about college, even though we had the state university there in our hometown, and I
Mhm.
knew professors, and I played with kids whose fathers were professors and so forth. But my folks didn't know a whole lot about universities. My mother had it in her head that the best universities were out of state. She wasn't quite sure like what those were. I mean, is it Harvard or
Yeah.
Oklahoma State? But her sense was that the really top notch places were somewhere else. And
Mhm.
so a kind of sub understanding of that first understanding, we're going to college, was you're going to college out of state. You got to find a really good college and go to a really good college out of state. So when senior year came and first semester, I went in as the other college bound kids did to see my guidance counselor. It's a lovely lady. I remember her very well. Her name was Carol Simons. I want to say she taught chemistry, if I remember correctly. And she
Mhm.
was certainly the coach of the girls' volleyball team. And she was the guidance counselor. And I said, Mrs. Simons, I'm here to see you about college. And she said, well, you're a good student.
Yeah.
You'll want to go to West Virginia University as opposed to one of the
Right.
satellite campuses where if your grades weren't as good, you'd probably end up there,
Yeah.
one of the community colleges in the state to begin, something like that. And I responded by saying, well, Mrs. Simons, I was thinking about going out of state to college. And she said, well, why would you want to do that?
Huh.
And there I was stuck because I didn't have a good answer to that question. It was my mom. So I said, well, sort of sheepishly, well, my mom wants me to. And Mrs. Simon said, well, that's expensive,
Yeah.
even if you go to a public university in Pennsylvania or Maryland or somewhere out of state, you
Yeah.
pay out of state fees. You've got a good university right here. It's actually right here in our hometown. Uh,
Mhm.
and it's not nearly as expensive. And I said, well, I'd still like to look at out of state colleges. So she handed me a great big old fat book. You're probably too young to remember this book. It was called Barron's College Guide. Barron's College Guide, and it had
Haven't heard of it.
yeah, you're too young. It had profiles of something like 3,000 colleges and universities. And she handed me that book, I think mainly because she had very little experience with sending students away.
Hmm.
She handed me that book,
Right.
looked at it, and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't read college profiles. What am I going to do with this? But I was leafing through it, and I noticed that in the front, uh, there was a list of all the 3,000 or so colleges, and they were classified into groups. And they were
Hmm.
classified by the selectivity of the admissions process. So some were most competitive, and some were highly competitive, and some were very competitive, and some were competitive, and some were not so competitive. And the very top category, most competitive, had 12 colleges and universities. There were
Okay.
six of the eight Ivies. Cornell and Penn
Hmm.
weren't in that category, but the other six were.
Hmm.
Stanford, if I recall, Caltech,
Hmm.
um,
Mm.
MIT, and then three what turned out to be smaller colleges. I'd never heard of them. One was Williams, one was Swarthmore, and one was Amherst.
Yeah.
So when I saw this classification, I thought, well, I can read those 12. I can read the profiles of those 12. So I just started reading, sitting there in Miss Simon's office. And of course, I figured out from the reading that three of these colleges were small. And I said to myself, Robbie, small is good for you. You're a hick from West Virginia. You're from the hills. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
you go to a big university, you're going to get lost.
Hmm.
Let's go to a place where you can't get lost. Uh, my folks took me to see these small colleges. I know we
Yeah.
saw one or two of the larger ones along the way when we were on the road trip in the truck. Actually, we had a crew cab truck,
Okay.
front seat and back seat. We stopped at Georgetown. I think that must have been on our way over to Swarthmore.
Hmm.
But gosh, when I saw Swarthmore, I just fell in love with it. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's just a beautiful place. It's literally this is not figurative. It's literally in an arboretum, a beautiful arboretum, and it's beautiful stone
Yeah.
buildings, and it was magnificent. And then the tour I got, instead of being part of a tour group, each prospective student was assigned an individual Swarthmore student. I had a sophomore. Her name was Peg Stone, uh,
Mm.
who gave me an individualized tour, and then took me to one of her classes, her 11 o'clock philosophy classes. It turned out. And
Hmm.
then from that class, we went down to lunch. And so that was all very impressive. But the thing that was
Hmm.
most impressive was that the class was just so cool. They were talking about these big, profound issues. Now, I didn't understand much, but
Hmm.
I knew that big stuff was being talked about. It all seemed so interesting. And then when the class was over and students started heading down as a group to lunch, there's just one dining hall on the campus because it's such a small college.
Hmm.
They continued
Right.
talking about the subject. They didn't talk about sports and dates and everything. They just continued talking about something. And then the whole way through lunch, they continued talking about the philosophical problems they had been discussing in the class. And I was just wowed by this. I have to tell you, Nick, I just thought this was the coolest thing ever. And I thought to myself,
Yeah.
if I could get into this school, this is the place for me. But then I thought, Robbie, how are you going to get into the? You're a hick from West Virginia. They're not
Right.
but I must have filled the Appalachian quota for the freshman class for that next year because
Yes.
they did admit me. Now, when I got there, I found myself in way over my head.
Did
There
you
was this,
really?
oh my goodness, I was so far behind. You've heard of people who don't know anything. I didn't even
Right.
expect anything. I mean, I
Right.
was, I was clueless in the dark. And there were these, my fellow students had been educated in these wonderful private schools or great public schools. And they
Hmm.
would talk about figures like Dostoevsky and Tolkien. Well, nobody ever told me anything about Dostoevsky or Tolkien,
Right.
any of this stuff. And I
Yeah.
didn't know. And at first, because I was embarrassed, I just tried to pretend that I understood who they were talking about or what they were talking. But of course, I was found out very quickly that didn't work. Uh, so I was so intimidated, and I was struggling. Honestly, I was struggling
Huh.
in that first year. I took political science class, I took an English class, I took a science
Yeah.
class. Uh, Unfortunately, there was a professor, wonderful professor. He's still alive, wonderful man. I'm forever in his debt. His name was James Kurth. Is James Kurth, and I had him
Hmm.
for an introductory political science course. I didn't sign up to take a course with him. He just happened to be the professor teaching the course I'd signed up for.
Yeah.
Uh, and he realized I was struggling, frankly. And he took me in. He made a project of me, took me under his wing, and he taught me how to handle college level work, how to write exams. I had no idea how to write exams, how to write term papers.
Yeah.
And he got me up and going. And then once I got my feet securely on the ground and kind of got hold of this college thing, well, then
Yeah.
I blossomed in it, and I took off, and I ended up doing very well academically,
Yeah.
really due to Mr. Kurt's mentorship, and then the mentorship of another wonderful professor that I encountered named Linwood Urban, who taught me medieval philosophy and philosophy of religion. Um, but the big crucial event, the turning point intellectually in my life that put me on the path to my vocation as a scholar and teacher happened in my second year.
Okay.
I was a sophomore, and to fulfill a distribution requirement, I took a survey course in political theory that began with Plato and went all the way up to John Rawls, who's
Mm-hmm.
century at that point current leading figure in political philosophy. Um, I wasn't especially interested in that subject matter. I took the course, as I say, to fulfill a distribution requirement. I hadn't read anything by Plato before. Can't remember exactly, but I doubt that I had heard of Plato before
Hmm.
college. Anyway,
Yeah.
the text from Plato that was assigned by my professor in that course, who was a man named Ken Sharp, was Plato's Gorgias. I don't know if you know that dialogue, Nick,
No, I don't.
your listeners do, but that's a dialogue in which Plato, through the figure of Socrates, his own,
Right.
um, forces us to face the question: why do we discuss, debate, argue, engage each other in conversation about issues? Why do we do that?
Mm-hmm.
Do we do it to impress people with how smart we are? Do we do it in a kind of contest to see who's the best? Are we seeking victory in our conversation and our debates and our
Right.
discussion? Are we trying to make money, get ahead, learn to be good talkers so that we can bamboozle people? Why are we doing this? And of course, Socrates spends his days in discussions. He's buttonholing people on the streets of Athens,
Mm-hmm.
engaging them in debates. And it's a debate about debates. And his
Yeah.
interlocutors, of course, are the sophists, who are people who are paid to teach the upper class young men of Athens to be good orators, to win arguments,
Right.
in order to maintain their family status or build their family status, to become important figures in Athenian public life, and so forth. And Socrates is taking them to task for treating this enterprise of debate, discussion, dialogue as purely instrumental to something else: getting ahead,
Mm.
money, having status, getting a political office,
Mm-hmm.
winning victories, as opposed to debating, discussing, arguing for the sake of getting at the truth of things, where the truth is understood not as something merely instrumentally valuable, not as a means to
Mm-hmm.
some end, but as an end in itself. Now, Nick, I had never considered the possibility that knowledge was something valuable for its own sake, intrinsic
Yeah.
fulfilling of the human person as the kind of creature we are, as rational creatures.
Right.
It's not that I had considered it and rejected it. I just had never considered it. Growing up, I was really taught by my parents to think of college and my future in college as an opportunity to um, gain greater social standing, a professional job, make more
Mm-hmm.
money, get ahead in life. It's not because my parents were bad people or because they were ignoramus. It's quite the opposite. Wonderful people. I'm so blessed to have the parents that I had.
Right.
But they themselves had never had the opportunity to think about why learning, why knowledge is ultimately valuable, not
Yeah.
instrumentally valuable. But as soon as Plato brought that to my attention, the light bulb went off over my head, and I could see that's true. That he's got the better side of the argument. That I was treating knowledge the way the sophists were treating it,
Mm-hmm.
but that was wrong. That
Yeah.
Plato's idea of knowledge is something that you should pursue just for its own sake because of its intrinsic value, that it's intrinsically fulfilling of the human person. I could see that that was right. Now, it's not, Nick, as if I suddenly decided, oh, okay, Plato's right, I'm going to be a professor. It didn't happen like that.
Right. Yeah.
But it did make me self-reflect, introspect. For the first time in my life, I asked myself the following question: Robbie, why do you believe the things you believe? I had all sorts of beliefs. I had all sorts of convictions. I'd been very politically active when I was in high school. I served 2 terms as governor of the West Virginia Democratic Youth Conference. I worked on campaigns. I debated. I was a very good debater. I was a good talker.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I believe it.
So all of a sudden, under the influence of this ancient Greek who grabbed me by the lapels and shook me, I
Right.
had to ask myself, why do you believe this stuff? Why do you believe the things you believe? And I honestly had to say, well, some of what I believe just because this is what I was taught by my family,
Right.
by my friends, by my community. Some of this is like picking it up in the ambient culture. Some of it, frankly, was stuff I believed because I thought this is what smart, sophisticated people believe. And I want to be a smart, sophisticated person, so I should believe
Right.
that. But
Yeah.
what was clear to me, what I had to confront myself with, compliments of Plato, was I hadn't earned my beliefs. I hadn't thought my way to them. Very
Yeah.
few exceptions, 1 or 2 exceptions. I just had them for essentially tribal reasons, one
Yeah.
or the other. So suddenly, everything was on the table. I realized I've got to rethink everything. I've got to think about everything: religion, politics, morality, culture, all this stuff, and then think my way to the conclusion. I have to earn my conclusions, earn my beliefs, my convictions. And I know I have to do that by considering the best that has been said or is to be said on the competing sides of these issues.
Yeah.
Now, it was both scary, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
You tend to build your identity around your convictions. You wrap your emotions more or less
Yeah.
around your convictions. So it's kind of scary because I didn't know where I was going to end up. And it was also exhilarating. I felt like
Mm-hmm.
a free man. I'm thinking for myself now, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, I'm going to be relying on these great thinkers I'm reading and people making arguments, but I'm now going to try to reason my way to my
Yeah.
conclusions. And what I found in the event, Nick, was that some of my beliefs I felt I had to abandon because they don't check out. They don't stand up under rational scrutiny. Others of my beliefs tended to be vindicated, and I became stronger in those beliefs. My beliefs strengthened. My religious beliefs strengthened. My
Yeah.
political beliefs, I began to change as
So
I began to think, no, this isn't holding up so well. But the bottom line is that was the beginning of a steady, gradual but steady process of coming to discern my vocation. My,
yeah.
I thought I'd be a lawyer or a politician. I did end up, of course, becoming a lawyer. But I thought I'd be
Yeah.
practicing law full time, and maybe I'd be running for public office, or I might be, a man of affairs. And now things were shifting, and I became so enamored of truth and of truth seeking. This desire to get at the truth, especially of important questions, led me to perceive, discern my vocation to be that of a scholar and a teacher. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who's a truth seeker or takes truth seriously has to be a scholar or a teacher. And we're not all called to the same things.
Right.
We are called to politics, business, journalism,
Right.
lots of things. But I realized I was called to be a teacher and a scholar. So I ended up doing something I never in a million years would have imagined when I walked onto the campus as a freshman at Swarthmore, which was becoming, what you now
Yeah.
see for
This
this.
long time professor at Princeton University.
Yeah,
So I want to interrogate something really quickly because
sure.
I think if someone didn't know a lot about you, and let's say the year's 2012 or something like that, they could see you and they could see you as a conservative Catholic professor at Princeton who holds more or less from the outside at the surface level, more or less standard Republican views on social issues, and I think on economic issues, or that would be the impression from the surface level. And I think though the parties kind of group these various views all in one thing. So if you're going to be a Democrat, you believe this long list of things. And if you're going to be a Republican, you believe this long list of things. The truth of each of these things, however you might define that, you're going to arrive at it. It's a different path. You're going to arrive at it at a different time. The
Absolutely.
fact that you believe in free market capitalism doesn't mean you oppose abortion, or anything like that. And so I imagine that you got to each of these beliefs separately.
Absolutely.
And I'd love to hear about those, but first with respect to the market side of things. On the economic side, where did the conservative beliefs where did the belief in the market, if you have a belief in the market, how you define that, where did that come from?
Okay, I do have a belief in the market. Um, and that comes from coming to see that command economies are very bad for the common good, very bad for people. They impede social mobility. They put much too much power in the hands of government. They deprive people of freedoms that are essential for those people to flourish in the material aspect
Hmm.
of their well being. Um, and markets, when properly regulated, but that's a very important point. See, I've never been a libertarian.
Right.
Never
Okay.
been a guy who says unregulated markets.
Right.
But most libertarians aren't strict libertarians. They don't want a completely unregulated market. But if a market is properly regulated, markets can lift people out of poverty, and they've done it. More people are free of poverty today because of the market system than because of socialist systems.
Right.
Yeah. So I also came to see that the correct understanding of the role of government with respect to, or by contrast to, the role of institutions of civil society, including
Mm.
private businesses and so forth. The proper role should be understood in light of a doctrine I now have a name for. I began to sense this before I knew the name of it. The label is subsidiarity. The
Mm.
doctrine develops in the 19th century in largely Catholic circles. It's not by any means a uniquely Catholic belief. And that's basically the idea that problems should be solved, um, people should be assisted, things should be gotten done at the lowest level at which they can effectively and responsibly be solved or gotten done.
Hmm.
So if a child can tie his own shoes, his parent shouldn't tie his shoes.
Right.
The kid tie the shoes once the kid is able to tie the shoes. Now there will be an early period when the kid can't tie his shoes.
Hmm.
The parent's going to tie the shoes, and the parent's going to teach the kid to tie the shoes. You know, um, and that's how it works in a family if it works right. And you want people to do things for themselves when they can do things for themselves, because as Aristotle taught, he's 100% right on this, our flourishing consists in our activity, not in having things done for you, or not in experiences, but in
Hmm.
activity. The good lies in, flourishing lies in action, doing things. So what you can do for yourself, you should do for yourself. What you can't do individually for yourself should be done in a group, but the smallest group you can. So if something can't be done by an individual, but can be done by a family, the baby can't raise
Hmm.
himself. Family can raise the baby. Let
Right.
the family do it. Don't hand the baby over to the city council if the family can do it.
Hmm.
Now, there's some things that the family can't do, but associations of families can do them and do them very well. Or other, what we call, following figures from Burke to Tocqueville, the institutions of civil society. If churches and other private associations can do them, well, let those institutions do them. Don't hand them over to larger units such as governments. Now, there will come a point at which private associations cannot do or do well or do effectively things that need to be done. And those are properly within the domain of government. But even there, if it can be done by a lower level of government, don't shift it to a higher level of government.
Hmm.
If it can be done at the local level, don't send it to the state or provincial or county level. If it can't be done at the local level, shift it to the next level up, but not to the national level unless it can't be done anywhere but at the national level. So,
Right.
we can't have counties taking responsibility for the national defense or for the space program
Right.
or for entering into treaties with foreign nations. That there's a proper role for the national government. But I'd like to see the doctrine of subsidiarity strictly honored. where we accomplish at the lowest level what can be accomplished at the lowest level. And ultimately, the explanation for that is that the good does lie in activity. This also provides for accountability. You you want things done at the level at which people can be held accountable. It's hard for me or you to hold people in Washington, D.C. accountable.
It is.
Bureaucrats in the
Yeah.
Commerce Department or the Defense Department, we can't hold them accountable very easily. We can hold the city council accountable.
Hmm.
That's easier to do. Um, Also, we need to be able to communicate with the people who are making critical decisions over our lives. So we want power exercised as close to the people over whom the power is exercised as possible. So I'd rather place the power in the hands of the city council, who's accountable to me. I can vote out of office relatively easily. I can organize against, rather than having
Right.
the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. and so forth. So I think there are lots of reasons to honor the principle of subsidiarity. And my respect for the market, my regard for the market, um, is just another reflection of that. But it does have to be a regulated market. Something should not be for sale, for example. Obviously,
Right.
human beings should not be for sale. Babies shouldn't be for sale. Some libertarians think we should have a market for adoption of babies. They go to the highest bidder. Richard Posner, the famous judge appointed by Reagan.
And yeah, an interesting judge. One you read a lot about in law school.
Yeah, he argued in
Yeah.
the Wall Street Journal that we should have a market in orphan babies or babies for adults. I think that's a horrible
Right.
idea. Some
I
people think
forgot
this should
that.
be a market in vital organs, that instead of having
Yeah.
our current system for heart transplants and liver transplants, we just put it in the hands of the market. I don't think hallucinogenic drugs should be for sale.
Hmm.
I don't think women should be for sale in prostitution. I don't think human embryos, embryonic human beings should be for. I mean, there are lots of things that shouldn't be for sale. Now, what that tells us is that the market's got to be morally bounded, and if it's not, then we're going to get into some serious dangers. And pretty soon we'll find that moral values are obscured and overridden by market values, where we come to see everything for sale, and then we fall into the vice. Here's the vice that defenders of what's sometimes called capitalism need to be very cognizant of. Capitalism generates enormous prosperity, and not just for the super rich. It generates general prosperity, but we have to be careful that it
Hmm.
doesn't turn the whole society into a bunch of consumerists and materialists and people who are only living for satisfaction and titillation and to buy the next new thing. And the market system does create incentives for producers of things to persuade people that the way to happiness, the way to salvation, is the next new gadget or the most expensive car or these kinds of things. So it's
Hmm.
not as if it's not as if there aren't dangers to the market system. They're just overridden, in my view, all things considered, by the dangers of the command economy, which are worse,
Hmm.
and by the need to respect the principle of subsidiarity, plus the benefits, the in terms of especially social mobility of a market system. I don't think that we should worry about inequality, even large inequalities of income. I mean, I think there's a fundamental principle of equality of dignity, which we should be,
Hmm.
but it doesn't bother me that some people have 7 billion or 28 or $100 billion, and other people have $100,000.
Hmm.
That doesn't bother me. I don't see there's anything intrinsically valuable about equality of income or equality of wealth. What I worry about is social mobility and
Okay.
the avoidance of poverty. If as and this is why I believe in the social safety net. So here's another respect in which I'm not a libertarian. I don't think that
Right.
government has no role. I think government does have a role in providing a safety net for those who would otherwise have um, be at risk of genuine penury because there's nobody else coming to their
Right.
assistance. So, and I while I'm at it, I also worry about, and this is when we get too much government intervention. So I think there's a place for the government as a last resort. But growing up in West Virginia in the 1960s, when the Great Society programs, many of them targeted at Appalachian poverty, came in, I can tell you that the warning that a few people issued at that time was entirely valid. And that was the warning against dependency. That if you don't run a safety net program, a welfare program properly, you will turn your clientele into dependence. I saw it happen. That's a bad thing. It's a bad thing for people. You're
Right.
you're not a lover of you're not a philanthropist. You're not a lover of mankind. You're not helping people if you turn them into dependents. You want people who can work to work. Now that means they've got to have jobs. You got to worry about making sure there are employment opportunities. And people who can't find work need a source of income. And sometimes that's going to be the state. That's going to be the government.
Hmm.
That's far from an ideal situation. In the ideal situation, people who can work should work because not only is it fairer to the taxpayer, it's much better for them.
Right.
Their dignity is much more greatly enhanced by working than by, in fact, it's undermined by being entirely able bodied, capable of working, job available, but you don't want to bother working. You just want to collect a check.
Yeah. Let's say for the sake of argument, let's grant all of that. Let's grant the benefits of subsidiarity, and and I think, frankly, you'd probably find in theory that people across the aisle, I think, kind of generally like that idea and like that theory, and think that conceptually it makes sense that you know okay, there are limitations to this. I think that the Democratic argument for a lot of it would be that um, when we do that, sometimes it works out, but then sometimes it goes so poorly that you end up you want the bigger, more powerful entity to step in and make sure that these smaller entities are obeying certain rules and whatnot. But skipping past that for a second, this comes up in the book, and I think it's a major issue. But you've seen over the last, I don't know how long. I'm 35, but at least over the course of my lifetime, and I think before then, you've seen the breakdown of certain of these more local, civic institutions, the churches, the synagogues, these community institutions that do a lot of what I think in some places the government is expected to do.
Yeah, true.
And you talk in the book, about this idea you want to be able to seek reform, acknowledging any problems that you do actually have, and there are many, without fracture. And it feels like over the last couple of generations, we've had a lot of fracture, and I'm not sure how much reform we've had.
Hmm.
And I'd be interested in your response to that, and what you see as a way forward.
Well, we have had a fracturing of our institutions. In many cases, you've had an excess of governmental control of the institutions of civil society. Parents' rights, for example, have eroded. Um, in the elite sectors of the culture, in universities, you'll find people who basically have adopted the view that children belong to the state, and the parents are sort of performing a state function or have a delegated power from the state to perform certain functions for children. But basically, uh,
Hmm.
the children belong to the state and not to the parents. It's exactly backwards.
Mm,
Children belong to their parents, not as property, of course, but they belong to
right.
their parents, and the state's role is subsidiary. It's secondary. There's a role for the state, and certainly in cases of abuse and neglect, the state does have to come in. No question about that. But we've got to make sure we have the understanding correct, and that is that children belong to their parents. The parents' rights are primary. The state's role here is secondary. Now, parents have the rights that they have because they have duties to their children. Children need their parents, and they need their parents to perform the duties the parents owe to those children. And the
Hmm.
rights parents have, they have because those rights need to be respected if they are to perform their or fulfill their obligations, their duties. So I want to get everything in the proper order here. And that
Yeah.
might, in most cases, mean that the state or institutions of the state are in a secondary or tertiary role, and institutions of civil society, beginning with the family, are in the primary role.
So that's interesting. So let's say, because I think there's actually a fair amount of movement for that specific example you talk about, returning control to parents. It feels like there's a lot of momentum on the right now for that to happen. There's certainly a lot of people that talk about returning primacy to parents. I think there's a growing or regrowing. I don't know what it was like before, but a growing homeschool movement, especially for younger children.
Yep.
Uh,
National
and
schools, charter schools in the
sure.
public domain, school choice. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of dissatisfaction with parents being pushed out of the picture, uh,
Hmm.
and especially in public education, the state playing too big a role,
Hmm.
and that's generated a movement back in the other direction, which is something I welcome.
Okay. So here's where I think it gets interesting. So let's stipulate for the sake of argument that you've had some sort of fracture, a decline in civic institutions. People aren't going to church as much. They're not
Oh yeah,
taking part in the PTA. A whole host of religious and non-religious civic organizations they don't have the numbers that they did, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. And I think what you're talking about with returning the primacy to the parents there, it's like that. So that's one specific example. I don't know what the outcome would be, what the impact would be on non-scholastic local organizations, but it feels like a Democrat, thinking about what some friends from New York City might say,
hmm
be like you're taking a leap of faith, taking this first step to restore things to their proper order in terms of the relationship between the state and the family, and then hoping that the downstream effect of that will be what you actually want to see, the regrowth of these community organizations. Is that fair to say, or is it like is the
yeah.
return to that a prime, an end in itself? Yeah, what's the thinking there?
Well, I mean, if the parents enjoying the rights that they, as a matter of natural law,
Mm,
should enjoy, that's an end in itself.
yeah.
Now, you, if parents are fulfilling their duties and have the right to do what they need to do and are doing it right, that's ultimately for the benefit of the child. The child ultimately, and the flourishing of the child, is the end to which those other things are means. But I think for the institutions of civil society, including families, to be revivified, renewed, we need to make sure that those families are not turned into mere instrumentalities of the state. And where they have been, to some extent, commandeered and turned into instrumentalities of the state, they need to be given their autonomy and authority back. And they need to be rebuild their integrity. But
Do you
they can't
mind?
do that if they're powerless. They have to be able actually to start doing the work that they're
Yeah.
supposed to be doing. Now, sometimes that's a matter really of having the government um, not just get out of the way, but provide various sorts of support, including but not exclusively financial support, that these institutions need if they are to be revivified. The government takes so much income, so much money in
Hmm.
taxation. If you look at local, state, and then the massive federal money draw,
Hmm.
that leaves much less money available for the institutions of civil society, churches, and other
Hmm.
institutions. So it seems to me sometimes, as a practical matter, the thing to do is to create something like what we failed to try, what we toyed with, but never really gave a shot at doing in the early 2000s, what was known back then as the faith based initiative. You're too young to remember this.
I've
And
heard the term, but I couldn't tell you what it is. Yeah.
so both the Gore and the Bush campaigns in 2000 ran on a platform of pr- launching what was called a faith-based initiative. And of course, Bush won the election, a very controversial contested election, ended up in the Supreme Court and so forth.
Hmm.
When Bush won, he instituted the faith-based initiative under the directorship of a Democrat um, professor. It happens to be a good friend of mine, former colleague of mine at Princeton, John DiIulio, who had advised both the Gore and the Bush campaigns on the faith-based initiative. And
Hmm.
Professor DiIulio was installed in the Bush administration as the head of the faith-based initiative. The idea there was to get more government money in the hands of institutions of civil society run by churches, soup kitchens, shelters for women and other people who are in danger,
Hmm.
all kinds of those types of institutions, to get money into their hands, because all the data compiled by Professor DiIulio and many other social scientists showed that the success rates for religiously based social service providers were far superior to the success rates for government provided services. So the question was, could you scale that by using government money to empower those institutions of civil society to do more of what they seem to be doing so well? Had the matter come to a fair test, I don't know what the outcome would have been. The
Hmm.
question was, can you scale it?
Yeah.
The danger would be, I mean, the bad outcome would have been that, well, once you get that much money into the hands of, let's say, an LDS or Catholic or Jewish charity, it begins to function the way the government run agencies function, and the success rates go down.
Yeah.
You're measured by whatever the proper metrics are for measuring the success rate of this or that uh,
Hmm.
program. But we'll never know because we didn't get a fair test. What happened is the faith based initiative got caught up in all sorts of culture war controversies about discrimination. Um,
Okay.
could churches uh, insist on hiring only members of their own religious
Mm. While taking government money, and
while
that,
taking
yeah.
government money? Now, what everybody agreed on was that if you got the government money, you had to serve whoever came through the door.
Okay.
So if you were a Catholic drug rehabilitation program, you had to serve people who were Baptist, atheist, Jewish, Buddhist, LDS, Hindu, whatever.
Yeah.
The question was, could you hire, if you wanted to, if you felt it was important to your mission, only people who were Catholic? And then you had some providers, especially Catholic ones, who said, we don't insist on our employees all being Catholic. There's no problem with we're willing to hire non-Catholic employees on even Steven terms, but
Yeah.
our employees have to um, lead their moral lives in ways that are in line with our church's beliefs. So, for example, they can't use drugs themselves, or they
Yeah.
can't be involved in same-sex sexual partnerships or something like that. It ended
Mm.
up with a huge controversy, which really blew up the program, and so we never got a fair test. I would love to get a fair test of something like the faith-based initiative, because we have prima facie evidence for understanding that faith-based social service providers do a better job. But
Yeah.
we don't know for sure is whether you can scale it.
Yeah. And so that's interesting because right there, with the controversy, you kind of highlight one of these big problems, which is that some of the decline, certainly not all, but some of the decline in attendance for these institutions relates to changing social mores, and whether you want to call that, an advance in our morality or a decline, that's
Yeah.
depends on your perspective, but it's like that has been a big part of it, and that is something, where like I don't know what you have, either the religious institutions do not change their dogma, and they're under no obligation to do so, but they do not change their dogma, which prevents, a large percentage of the population from ever kind of rejoining the congregations and prevents the regrowth of these traditional community institutions. Or you do have a changing of dogmas, not in all, but in some maybe, and you do see that, certain religious institutions have had certain changes to their dogma over the last 20 years. And then maybe you have a regrowth, but then at the same time, it felt like, some of what was so strong in the institutions before, like, did have to do with the dogma. It maybe not the dogma itself, but had to do with this idea that you had rules, and the rules did not change. That either they came down on, from on high, or they had been reasoned out by very smart and spiritual people over a long time,
Mhm.
hadn't changed in a long time. So you had the strength of these traditions, and which all kind of gets to this question. It's like, now I think that's why, and obviously this comes up in the book, and we see it in our modern politics. You see on the left, you see the growth of new tribes with new, what we can call dogmas.
Yeah,
And then I think you're starting to see a fair amount of that on the right as well,
yeah.
and not just with the rise of Christian nationalism, but with a like a pseudo Christian American nationalism, where it's all kind of synthesized together. Um, I, I don't know what to do about that, but I would be
I
interested
have
in
some
what you
thoughts
think
about
would
that,
be going.
as you can imagine.
Yeah,
Yeah. So first of all, we now know this with certainty. We have enough experience over the last several decades to know that if you dilute the stringency of your moral teachings, imagining that you are making your faith more inclusive, and supposing that as a result of that, more people will feel comfortable and will join your religious community. Um, if that's what you were hoping for, you now know it doesn't work. All I have to do is mention the two words Episcopal Church
right.
or Presbyterian Church or
Yeah.
Presbyterian Church USA, anyway, or the United Church of Christ or what have you. So, and then look on the other side. I mean, those churches that are holding their own or growing are those that hold to more traditional and rigorous standards of behavior in the domain of
Hmm.
sexuality and family, especially. So there we know there we're not speculating, we're not guessing. We know about that. Um, so a lot of people who have abandoned in their own lives traditional moral principles haven't fled into more liberal churches. They've become secular. But as you just pointed out, that's a secular with an asterisk beside it because
Right.
it's secular in one sense. God isn't centrally in the picture, but it looks an awful lot like a religion or pseudo religion in another sense because it has dogmas and saints and demons and holy days and holy months and all the indicia of
Right.
religion. Those people who say that woke ideology is a religion, John McWhorter being the most famous, the Columbia linguistics professor, John McWhorter. Um, they're not just blowing smoke. I mean, they're onto something there. Now,
Hmm.
I wouldn't say strictly a religion. I'm more likely to describe it as a pseudo religion. But I know what he's driving at here.
Right.
It plays the role in the lives of what we might call the faithful that religion plays in the lives of, say, a faithful Catholic or Latter day Saint or uh,
Yeah.
Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist person.
Yeah. And so it also gets at another thing. I think it's indicative of, maybe what we might call kind of an underlying, eh, well, a need for definition, a need for some ideology, a need to be able to decide who is good and who is bad, and a need to justify yourself as good. And what? So if you leave God, and many have and do, and as some come back, whatnot. But if you leave God, I who was it that wrote recently about the God-shaped hole? I'm not sure who it was exactly,
It
and
was
I know Richard Dawkins
Ian,
disputed it.
it was Ian Hersey Ali,
Yes.
and
Okay.
explaining her abandonment of her atheist faith and her embracing of Christianity. She said she realized that there's a God-shaped hole. It was not an original thought with her.
Right.
Someone told me that it actually goes back to St. Augustine. I don't ever recall reading that in St. Augustine, but in any event, it wasn't original, nor did she claim it was original with her. But
Yeah.
that's how she articulated it. I realized that there's a God-shaped hole, and I think what she meant by that is she had come to realize that people are spiritual creatures, that we're not just material. We in our most immediate experiences of ourselves as free and rational creatures, agents.
Yeah.
Where not everything can be reduced to causality, the domain of causality. So, as spiritual creatures, we yearn, we long for a kind of spiritual life, a spiritual fulfillment. We soon learn, or eventually learn, maybe not soon, sometimes it's later rather than sooner, but eventually we learn that just living a life for satisfaction, for gratification, for getting things, for getting ahead, status, money, power, prestige, those are not ultimately fulfilling, because there's that God-shaped hole. There's that spiritual dimension of ourselves that can only be fulfilled by being in a relationship with a more than merely human source of our spiritual reality, a more than merely human source of meaning and value, what theistic religious people have always had in mind when they use the label God.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, this leads me to two questions, one of which is the role of religion, not just in civic society, but in determining like the moral strictures of the government. Because to go from my personal life, so I'm from Utah. I'm talking to you from Utah right now. 2012, LDS guy. I didn't vote for Mitt Romney, and the reason, and I don't know. It's funny, like some of this. I'm still a amiably skeptical liberal, but but
Not for the amiable. I'm really
very,
glad.
very, very amiably. I mean, that's what I'm doing with this whole thing.
My liberal
But
friends these days are not feeling very amiable.
this is a dark time for some. But my views are much better informed today than they were when I was 18 when Obama ran in 2008. And, it was really exciting, and then I Obama's this incredibly charismatic figure, and then I didn't have the highest opinion of Governor Palin. And so that was a pretty easy vote. And then in 2012, it was much more difficult because here's a guy who shares so much of my identity. At the time, I hadn't been to law school yet, but Mitt Romney represented a lot of what I would have been trying to be. And then had, this faith in common. There's a huge thing. That's the only time I've ever been in the line to vote and waffled, despite, like, policy-wise at that point, I was convinced. I had the confidence of a 22-year-old. I was ready to go. Let's go, Barack. And and looking back, it's not that it would have changed my vote necessarily, but you see it with a more of a fullness, and you see some more holes. But
at some point, Nick, you've got to get Brother Cornel West on your show to talk about Barack Obama.
I'd love to have him on. To plug the book really quick.
There we go.
It was enjoyable to the point of being spiritual. It was enjoyable to the point of being spiritual. And if being in your class, your shared class, is anything like reading this book, it's got to be just an absolute joy and a pleasure for your students. In that way that you acknowledge in the book is sometimes transformative or very uncomfortable, but like it just incredible. But so going back to 2012, so LDS, the church teachings, no gay marriage, just to make it simple. But I, at the time, could not find an argument other than what was taught at church that made me think it was wrong, that really stood up to scrutiny, that I wasn't kind of backfilling based off religious belief.
Well, that's because you hadn't read my book, which is Ryan Anderson, What is Marriage, Man and Woman in Defense, which is not necessarily your fault because it had just been published. So you would have had to read it really quickly. But had you read it, you would have been refreshed.
And so I maybe I should go back and read it, but it was...
What do you mean you haven't read it yet?
I haven't read it yet. I apologize. I should have read it in anticipation of the call.
Educate yourself.
I know, I know, but there was that basic fundamental, and it wasn't just informed by that specific issue. It was like, okay, obviously, gay marriage at the time was a big uh, that was a flashpoint for a lot of people on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
But in between, these various, and obviously there are many churches on the left and many people in churches on the left, and frankly,
Well,
I was
fewer
one
and
of
fewer people in the churches. There are many churches on the left, but it's a dying congregation.
you are statistically, it would be hard to dispute that. But obviously, just going off my own faith tradition, you look at, LDS people, don't drink alcohol, don't drink a number of other things. And those are, at least, okay, forget prohibition for a moment. At least right now, those are not things that even LDS people are seeking to have forbidden by an instrumentality of government. And so for me at that time, you know, it was the way I thought about it was, as a member of a what you might call a minority faith, certainly one that has historically been so, and Mitt Romney faced a whole lot of skepticism from many people, conservative people of faith, because of his faith. But I Mitt Romney isn't going out there saying, while we're at it, we don't want gay marriage, but you know what, we're also going to ban alcohol. We're not going to do coffee. There are some teas that are going to be out of bounds. So he wasn't campaigning on that. And so to me, so how would you draw this distinction between that? It's like, why is it okay for the government to, or why is it recommended for the government to ban gay marriage, but not, use of, whatever else might be the uh, preference of the, dominant religion of the time?
All right, so much there to disentangle on.
Sorry. Yeah. Long. Yeah. Right.
Uh, for the long version of the story, go to my first book.
Okay.
My first book was called Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, published in 1993, Oxford University Press. It's still available. Unfortunately, they're putting it out now at a horrible price.
What is that price?
It's $79 or something. I mean,
My gosh.
they're trying to get people not to buy it so they won't know the truth. Uh, I've argued with them. I'll give up my royalties. They're not that great anyway. And I cannot get them to lower the price or do anything like that. But anyway, um,
Man.
I was interested in that issue. What is the relationship between law and morality? When
Mm-hmm.
should law reflect, embody morality? When should when should moral obligations be enforced? When should they not be
Mm-hmm.
enforced? And it's all treated in the book. And here, the book is largely a critique, sympathetic one in some ways, but a critique of the liberal ideology that you just articulated in your own voice, in your own name, that you would often hear people say in those days, less often today, but you still would hear people say, you really can't legislate morality, or
Mm-hmm.
if we're not going to ban everything we think is bad, then we have no justification for banning anything we think is
Okay.
bad. Or moral norms are just sectarian religious ideas, and we have a First Amendment in this country, and we have freedom of religion, and we don't have an established church. Established church is prohibited. Therefore, we shouldn't enforce morality. As I pointed out, we enforce morality all the time. Think civil rights laws.
Mm-hmm.
We It's hard to think of a law that doesn't reflect at some level a moral judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Restrict liberty all the time based on ideas of good, bad, right, wrong, just, unjust, moral concepts. We have ideas, our laws that filled with ideas based on claims about human rights. Well,
Mm-hmm.
are moral, if they're anything, if they exist, if they obtain, if there is such a thing, those are
Yeah.
moral ideas. So I think the whole thing is a mistake. And what we need to be thinking about, that whole liberal project was a mistake. And I tried to establish that it was a mistake in the book, and I followed that up with various other writings on the subject, responded to critics and so forth. But I think the way we should be thinking of it is, when does the common good require that a moral obligation be enforced? Or when is the common good significantly enhanced by a moral obligation being enforced? And when, because there will be some times when the common good is actually undermined by the enforcement of a moral obligation. I'll give you a
Hmm.
simple example of a latter case. We have obligations in gratitude to those who have been beneficent toward us. So if grandma sends you a sweater for Christmas, whether or not you like the sweater or ever intend to wear it, says maybe grandma, doesn't quite understand your style.
Right.
Um, you still have an obligation to express gratitude and real gratitude.
Right.
It's the thought that counts. Just because you don't like the sweater doesn't mean you can't be, shouldn't be grateful to grandma.
Right.
Now, that's a moral obligation, but it's the kind of moral obligation that cannot be enforced without undermining the very good that you're trying to uphold. Contrast that with a civil rights law, or contrast that with a law. Libertarians don't like these laws against um, distributing recreational drugs or selling recreational drugs or using recreational
Hmm.
drugs. There you could have competing prudential reasons not to enforce the moral obligation. But what they're competing against are the respects in which the common good can be advanced by enforcing the moral obligation. Um, Now, sometimes it's a close call. The
Yeah.
case for prohibition, when prohibition was enacted, was very strong.
Right.
And what people these days forget is that prohibition did have positive effects. It not only lowered the alcoholism rate, it lowered the thing that prompted the prohibition movement in the first place, which was the abuse of women and children, the abuse and neglect, including violence against women and children by intoxicated, alcoholic men, basically. Um, the trouble was, it also came with some bad effects. Organized crime. It filled the coffers of organized crime. It led to a
Hmm.
very widespread corruption of the police. And there were other considerations. That's a prudential judgment call. It's not a matter of principle.
Right.
Prudential judgment call. It's not a clear case. And in the event, we experimented with prohibition. We got the benefits, but the public became persuaded that the costs as opposed, weighed against the benefits, did not justify the experiment. And so we repealed prohibition. Now, you fell into the common usage of saying ban gay marriage or forbid gay marriage. Of course, it wasn't a question of banning or forbidding anything. It was a question of what we as a community will recognize as a marriage and what we won't. It's the same question we face if we ask the question, can three people be married? Can four people be married? Five people as a unit? Not just polygamy, where you have one man who has three separate marriages, one to Helen, one to Sarah, one to Joanne, but where Helen, Sarah, Joanne, Bill, and John are all in a sexual partnership together as a unit.
Hmm.
You got to ask, are we going to treat that as a marriage or not? And the best way to address that question is to ask, is it really a marriage? And that means there's no avoiding the question, well, what is marriage? Is it simply a form of sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership?
Hmm.
If it's that, then yes, two people of the same sex can be married, just as two people of opposite sexes can be married, but so can three people or five people or seven people.
Hmm.
It can be sexually open or sexually closed. It can be for life, till death do us part, or 5 years renewable, like any other ordinary contract.
Right.
That's if marriage really is, and therefore our law should embody the idea that it's sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership. But of course, that's never what marriage was in our law and culture. It was understood as a conjugal partnership. That is a form of life that brings together a man and a woman as husband and wife to be father and mother to any children born of that union, conferring upon those children the inestimable blessing and benefit of being brought up in the committed love, the marital partnership, marital love of the two biological progenitors of the child, and also giving the child the benefit of both, whether it's a boy or girl child, of maternal and paternal care and influence and relationships. All of that can explain what's otherwise inexplicable historically about marriage. Why, for example, marriages have to be consummated in order to be complete. If marriage is just a form of domestic partnership, sex may typically be part of it, but it doesn't have to be. It's not inherently a sexual relationship. So why would you have what all our laws had, not just our religious law, our secular law, which is a consummation requirement? Absent consummation, marriages are incomplete and can be annulled. You don't need a divorce in that case if you don't want to be married. You haven't consummated the marriage, so it's not a marriage. Well, that in itself would show that marriage is a comprehensive union of persons, uniting people not simply at the emotional level, which would be the case if marriage were simply a form of sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, but rather uniting people at all the levels of their being. Yes, the psychological, but also the rational and the dispositional, and at the foundation, the biological. So that the biological, the bodily union of husband and wife becomes the matrix of the multi-level sharing of life at every level of human being that marriage is. So, those are somewhat deep waters when you specify it all out, but it becomes very clear that it's a question that society cannot handle simply by saying, well, let the law be neutral as to what marriage is. The law will embody an understanding of marriage, which will include a moral view. Now, the
Hmm.
question is, which one will it be? The current law, which of course allows for same sex partnerships, not, or not at least yet, polyamorous ones, but that's coming. The current law is not neutral. It embodies
Right.
somebody's view of what marriage is. It's not mine.
Right.
So
Right.
we just don't have the option of neutrality. So much of my early work was meant to show, and I like to think successfully showed. You can read my work and see what you think. That the neutrality claim that's at the heart of the kind of liberalism we're talking about here is just an illusion. That liberalism smuggles in a substantive view, like its view of marriage,
Right.
under the pretext of being morally neutral.
Yeah, that's interesting. It certainly is a substantive view. And thinking back, so let's so I think you say, and let's stipulate that marriage comes with a certain suite of rights, that come along with forming a marriage under the law. Inheritance rights with respect to surviving spouse, that sort of thing. Um, you know, uh, I don't know what adoption rules there would be necessarily, but it seems like that's a lot easier to do once you're married. Um, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that you have to be married to adopt. Um,
You don't, but that's fine. Yeah.
okay, all
I
right.
mean,
Oh, okay, fair enough.
the conservative talk show host Laura Ingraham, I think, adopted 3 children. She's single.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, all right, good to know. Um, so, from what I recall, there were certain people on the left who, using a different forms of arguments to try and make the same point or get to the same end, and you have these arguments coming out of pathos where it's like you have people, gay men or lesbian women, that have been together, their whole lives, or whatever, as long as a normal marriage would be, and they get to the end, one of them dies, and now the other one cannot inherit, what had been the property of the other. Was that something you specifically addressed, or
Well,
opposed, or
there
would have
are,
been okay with?
yeah, I mean, there are certain contingent matters that are incidental to marriage, and different
Hmm.
societies attach various contingent um, benefits or rights or privileges or immunities to
Yeah.
marriage, but they're not inherent to what it is. There's nothing inherent to the idea of marriage that requires that there be, like an automatic 1/3 of an estate goes to the spouse. I mean,
Right.
different societies have different laws about those things. It's not inherent to the
Right.
institution of marriage. And so depending on the conditions of your society, its history, its traditions, its circumstances, the needs of the people in the society, you can shuffle those around. You can do them in different ways. You can handle those benefit sorts of questions, hospital visitation, insurance rights. You can do that in countless ways without redefining marriage.
Interesting. Yeah. No.
And
Yeah.
you
I mean,
just
yeah,
argue about each
do
of them
contract.
on the merits. You just say, well, given our circumstances and conditions and the needs of the people and so forth, what works best for us.
Yeah.
But it was, I mean, you realize, I mean, I hope I'm not breaking news. It was all a stalking horse. I mean, that wasn't what the debate was about. It wasn't about,
Right.
and I found a way to actually prove that. During the
Hmm.
debate, the Supreme Court of New Jersey ruled that the New Jersey legislature had two options. It could either redefine marriage to make marriage available to same sex partners, or it could create a system that would make sure that the contingent benefits of marriage, such as insurance coverage and inheritance rights and so forth, were available to same sex partners on the same terms as married partners. So I went down to the state legislature when it was holding hearings and trying to decide which of those courses to take under the judicial mandate. And I proposed to them a system of domestic partnership in which all the rights and privileges of marriage, such as insurance coverage and inheritance rights and so forth, would be equal between marriage and the domestic partnership scheme. But the domestic partnership relationship would not presuppose a sexual relationship between the partners. So that any two people who had a domestic partnership, were in a relationship of mutual need, whether they were in a sexual partnership or not, or whether they lawfully could be in a sexual relationship or not, would be eligible for domestic partnership status. So you could have two elderly sisters who lived together, took care of each other. They needed to be able to visit each other in the hospital. They needed insurance coverage on each other's employment, parts of each other's benefit packages and employment and so forth. And they would be eligible too. This would just expand the pool of eligible people so that everyone's needs were met. All like cases were treated like. Now, when I
Hmm.
proposed that, I knew that the same sex marriage lobby would oppose it. Now, what possible grounds would they have for opposing it? What conceivable grounds are you going to say, we have two people who are eligible for these benefits if they're having sex with each other? But if
Hmm.
they're not, they're not eligible. If those two elderly sisters who need these benefits as much as, Harry and Sam, they're excluded. Now, why do you think that was?
Well, I mean, because they do want the validity of the sexual relationship acknowledged on the same terms. Yeah.
Bingo.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I don't regret or change my position, but that's interesting. I need to go back and read your book.
You need to read my book, Brother Nick.
Let me, okay.
It opens
Got a couple
minds.
of, of that, I have no doubt. Let's see. Oh, shoot. Now, what was the question I was going to? Yes. Okay. So you have this long-standing relationship with Dr. West. Okay.
Yes.
Now you've been teaching a class together for some time, and you are,
One of the great blessings of my life, Nick.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is very cool. And there are two things that I think are two observations kind of jump just right off the page. So one, and this is why so many people are so interested in it. You are, a conservative Catholic. He is a quite progressive Baptist, and you two, despite being quite far apart politically, maybe not as far apart as you can go, but you're working at it. You have this great personal relationship, and not just personal relationship, but you have this ability to have dialogue together, and not just have dialogue together. You seek dialogue together, and you learn from each other. So that's one observation. But the second one, and this is what I was wondering: how much have you changed each other's minds?
I think if you look at try to find specific issues on which we've changed each other's minds on policy, I don't think you're going to find anything, or not much.
Yeah.
Um, I think what we've done is we've deepened each other's understanding, and in many cases, I think, made each other see that an issue that seemed simple is actually much more complex. Let me tell you about from my side.
Mm-hmm.
So I had held for many years, most of my life, the what I now see is somewhat simplistic, conservative, typical conservative position that, you know, race consciousness is just a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
We got into these problems with race because people were race conscious. White supremacy is a race conscious doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And the way out of these problems is not more race consciousness, whether it's black race consciousness, white race consciousness, Asian race consciousness. We need to stop thinking in terms of groups, start thinking in terms of individuals. After all, you know, there's really no such thing as race. It's a social construct. It's a 19th century or 18th century artifact, cultural artifact. You know, it's just melanin in your skin, and you know, and certain other contingent, minor, meaningless biological characteristics that have to do with maybe the shape of the eyes or the texture of the hair and things like that.
Right.
It's nothing. It doesn't mean it's meaningless.
Right.
So, you know, let's just cut it out. Stop thinking about race. And that led me to be skeptical even about having programs like African American studies departments. Say,
Mm.
why do we need that? That's just feeding into the idea that there really is such a thing as race, and it really does matter. To now cite the title of one of Brother West's most famous books,
Right.
"Race Matters." So I thought race didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my engagement with Cornel over many years and wrestling with his arguments and listening to what he has to say and thinking about it has led me to see, well, I still think we exaggerate the role of race.
Mm-hmm.
We pay too much attention to race, and we do need to start treating people more as individuals and less as members of categories. And yet, there are good reasons for us to understand that there have been cultures with valuable components, bodies of literature, art, music, philosophy, understanding that have come out of race based experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So there is such a thing as an African American culture
Right.
and a literature. Well, that what the culture is among other things a literature,
Mm-hmm.
a tradition of art, a tradition of music, um, some philosophical contributions. Um, just as there's similar things in the Jewish world
Right.
or in the Irish world, contributions to art, culture, literature. And just as people can value their Jewish heritage and tradition and identify with that, or their Irish heritage and tradition, there's no reason for African Americans not to value and identify with and be proud of their cultural tradition. And so it
Right.
makes sense to have, say, an African American studies department in the same way that it makes sense to have a Jewish studies department, or in some places, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
an Irish studies department. You know, think about the wonderful folk music of Ireland, the wonderful literature of Ireland, some of the great
Yeah.
religious contributions that have come out of Ireland, and so forth. So I see that the issue, this is typical for Cornell and me, how we end up affecting each other. I see that the issue is not as simple as I thought. It's much
Mm-hmm.
more complex than I thought. It's not just do away with race consciousness, solve our problem.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think I've probably made him very nervous. He once said to me, you know, you've made me very nervous about my views about abortion because, you know, I've hammered away on the dignity of the child in the womb and
Yeah.
the possibility of drawing a distinction between an unborn child and a born child, that from the earliest embryonic stage, what you have is a living individual member of the human species. And that all the only differences between an embryo and a fetus and a newborn infant and an adolescent and an adult are stages of development. They're not separate things. They're not different things. And some are human and some aren't human. They're all human. They're human beings at different stages of development. And I think he hadn't really heard or come to appreciate or taken seriously some of the considerations I've laid on the table until he found himself engaging with me on those things. Now, he hasn't yet changed his view on
Yeah.
what our policy should be, but he worries about it in the same way that I worry about some of these racial issues that seemed so simple to me before.
Yeah. That's interesting. Man, abortion is a very tough one.
It's not tough, it's simple. It's emotionally wrenching because real women have real issues and real problems and
Right.
needs and their real issues. I mean, but if we steadily ask ourselves, do we believe that human beings, as such, every member of the human family is the bearer of profound, inherent, and equal dignity? Do we believe in human rights? That is, rights we have not on the basis of achievements, not on the basis of age or sex or stage of development or condition of dependency or race or ethnicity. If we believe there are certain rights we have simply in virtue of our humanity, this question is not difficult. Now, they're difficult. There are marginal cases, obviously. There's
Hmm.
intentionality analysis that has to be done in some cases. You have to show why, as I have on many occasions in my own writings, dealing with an ectopic pregnancy where the death of the embryo is a foreseen side effect of an intervention necessary to save the life of the mother is morally acceptable. That's all got to be explained. But
Hmm.
what is not, I think, difficult, really, intellectually and morally, if we would only steadily keep our eye on the ball and not allow ourselves to be distracted by other considerations, is that there's nothing different about an unborn baby in terms of human dignity. Anyway, we may disagree about that.
No, but no, well, no, I actually I appreciated the explanation you gave in the book, in the conversation, where you're talking about it from a Catholic point of view, where an action you take that has the incidental, effect of terminating a fetus that is done to save the life of the mother, like that's morally acceptable. If you're doing something specifically to terminate the fetus, like that, am I correct in saying that's where the
Yeah, that's
distinction
right.
is?
So it's not unique. It's
Yeah.
the same issue we have, for example, that enables us to distinguish those poor souls who jumped out of windows when the World Trade Center was hit by those planes because the rooms were on fire. When they jumped out of the windows, inevitably knowing knowing that they would be killed, they were
Yeah.
not committing suicide. They were not intending their own deaths. They weren't like the person who says, I hate myself, I hate my life, I'm going to jump out a window so I'll be dead. Or they're not even like the
Yeah.
person who says, I want my beloved child who needs a surgical operation to recover enough money on my life insurance policy to be able to afford the operation. So I'm going to get myself dead so that he can recover on the insurance policy. If you can see that distinction, or the distinction between in targeting civilians in justified wars and accepting the death of civilians as an unintended but foreseen side effect, that it's exactly the same thing. If you can see that, you've got it. It applies no
Yeah.
differently in the case of the child in the womb.
Interesting. So my project, what I'm doing, a lot of this came out of thinking there are people on the right and the left that don't have this relationship with the other side, that don't see how complicated that is, and that because of their lack of exposure, I think primarily because of their lack of exposure to uh, good thinking on the other side, they end up with a very simplistic view where it's a pretty natural conclusion that either your opponents are acting in bad faith
Mm-hmm.
or are just kind of dumb.
Idiots. Yeah, they're idiots. Yeah, that's the
And,
danger that
and
into thinking of
yeah,
is either fools or frauds.
right, exactly. And I see that on both sides, and so this is something that has always kind of been front of mind for me because as someone that grew up in Utah, but politically did not go along with the dominant culture, and then went to UVA, which is a more conservative law school, but certainly is still more liberal than conservative, and then went to New York City, where I meet people for the first time that have having grown up in the city and having gone to these great liberal dominated schools on the East Coast, have genuinely never had a conversation with a social conservative that about socially conservative things. They didn't know they were talking to a social conservative if they were. And so you end up just really not able to understand how someone could possibly reach this foreign alien conclusion on an issue that is so obvious to you. And I think what I'm doing, there's two primary purposes. One of which is to enable granted at a much lower and simplistic and less well-read level, what you have with Dr. West, that both of you, the allusions to various authors of grand repute is incredible. And I mean, I haven't read probably 98% of what you mentioned in the book. So, you added quite a bit to my reading list. But then the second part of it, of what I'm trying to do, is that I think, not knowing why other people think what they think in their terms, you can say that they believe that because they're a hillbilly or because they're a bigot or racist or communist or, whatever epithet you want to use. It strengthens your ability to make arguments. If you actually know why the other side thinks that, either we should or should not have gay marriage, you're going to be able to make an argument that they can understand, or you're going to have a better chance at making an argument they can understand, which will hopefully lead to the outcome either that they respect your position more or that they actually take your position. And I would be interested to hear, because so you have this experience with Dr. West where you don't move each other a lot. You just really increase the respect you have for each other, and you both really understand the arguments on both sides.
Well,
Do you
and
have
deepen your understanding of the issue.
right?
The example I gave you of Cornel's influence on my thinking on race is that I think I've got a much deeper understanding of the issue than the relatively superficial one with which I began.
Yeah. And have you had any experience where, maybe, because I understand you serve on a number of boards and have been involved with the government, maybe not as you originally thought you would be involved back when you were in college, but you have been in positions of influence or access to to people that are you've had influence on or access to people that are making policy decisions.
Yeah.
And have you found that this practice that maybe you've perfected or made very public with Dr. West has been something that has helped or worked for you? It's kind of a vague question, but
Well, I hope that I can be a better advisor to those who've sought my advice, who exercise public authority,
mhm.
because I understand the issues more deeply. The more deeply I understand the issues, the better I'll be able to advise, and the more likely that my advice will be good advice rather than bad advice. And if you're giving advice, you always fear that, gosh, what if I'm wrong?
Yeah.
you know, so that's
Well, you hope you fear it.
yeah. Well, you should. If you don't, you should. I mean,
Right.
so yeah. I mean, what I don't want is just to become a more effective advocate of whatever my view happens to be. I don't want to just become a better rhetorician, because what if I'm wrong? And I'm just more
Right.
effective in persuading people that I'm wrong. So I want to understand the issue more deeply, and then if I understand the issue more deeply, I ought to be able to explain it more coherently and intelligibly to people who've sought my advice. So that's been my experience.
Do you have any thought? So it feels like, one of the great barriers to this is that we do have something of a bifurcated media landscape.
Yeah, we sure do.
I think both sides of the political aisle kind of feed into it. We're in an era where I, that I haven't read Thraspicus, and I don't know if that's actually how you say his name, but the comes up in the book.
So Thrasymachus is the
Thrasymachus, there
character
we
in the
go.
Republic who basically stands for, I'm oversimplifying slightly, but stands for
Yeah.
a view that might makes right.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to.
Okay. It feels like there's a lot of that
Absolutely.
on both sides.
Yeah.
It's certainly, I mean, very famously, there's a lot of that right now on the right. Although I think there's plenty on the left too.
There's plenty on both sides.
Yeah. Can you think of a historical example, or do you have any hope in any practical steps for moving past that, like as a country, or moving past that as a community?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, the best example is Lincoln. Every American, every year, at least once, should read Lincoln's second inaugural address. Fortunately, it's very short. It's very easy to do. You read it in 5 minutes. And the reason I think people should read it is to get an appreciation of the man's magnanimity. He's just about
Mhm.
he's he's about to win a big victory. He knows. He begins the speech by
Right.
saying, he says it more politely, but basically, this war's just about over and we're going to win.
Yeah.
But then instead of beating his chest and saying, "Hooray for me! I'm the great victor. I'm joyous," he he reaches out. He reflects. He he reflects on the causes of the war, and he says the war is brought as a punishment by God on both sides.
Yeah.
And he notes that both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God. And of course, God can't give both sides what they want. And he says God has given neither side fully what they want. And then he says, this is so powerful, Nick. He says, it may be hard for us. He's now talking about the Union people, the anti-slavery people. It may be hard for us to understand why anyone would ask from a just God that they be allowed to eat the bread that comes from the sweat of another man's brow. That's a reference to slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And he immediately says, but let us judge not, lest we be judged. And then, of course, come the magnificent words that we all remember in closing. Instead of saying, "Hooray for me, big victory, we vanquished the enemy," he said, "Now let us move forward with confidence in the right as God gives us to see the right, to care for the widow and orphan, but we should do it with malice toward none and charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right." And then we move forward. That's the right attitude. It wasn't, "I was right all along." It wasn't,
Right.
"I'm the great victor. I'm the great hero. We won, you lost." None of that. There's the right attitude. And Lincoln said, somebody said once to Lincoln, "Isn't it great that we're on God's side?" I'm sorry, I got it wrong. I got it exactly wrong. "Isn't it great that God is on our side?"
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
That's not the question. Whether God, the question is, are we really on God's side? He's questioning himself. He's
Yeah.
recognizes his own fallibility. He's realizing, we can be wrong, not just about the minor, trivial, superficial things of life. We can be wrong about the big, important things of life. We can be wrong about causes that we think are so virtuous and so just. But we're frail, fallible, fallen human beings, and we can be wrong about them. We can be on the side of injustice, all the while thinking that we're the great heroes of justice. Again, Lincoln is such a great model for this.
I really love that. I tell you the truth, I read it last night while reading the book. It's like,
The
hey,
second inaugural?
yes, I did.
Oh, good for you, Nick.
Yeah, well, wait, if there were a couple of times I had to look something up, and it was really nice. I actually thought about including it in the article I wrote that went out today, which was somewhat critical of our recently departed President Biden. It's actually quite critical, but yeah, I'm going to get that in there somewhere at some point.
Well,
But
I
okay, this.
see that my battery's about to die on my.
Yeah, I was going to say you have been so generous with your time. So let me ask you one last question.
Sure.
What gives you hope about the future of the country?
My students, the young people I teach every day. So many of them here at Princeton, especially my students who are undergraduate fellows of the James Madison program. Not only are they brilliant, you don't get into Princeton unless you're pretty smart.
Right.
So
Yeah.
they're brilliant, and that's fine. That's great. It's wonderful. It's important. I'm proud of them for their brilliance and so forth. But even more importantly, they're so courageous. And I have to say this especially about my conservative students. I'm sure it's also true of the more liberal students, but the more liberal students aren't challenged the way the conservatives are.
Yeah.
These conservative students are willing to stand up and speak the truth as they best understand the truth. They can be wrong, they're fallible, but as best they understand the truth, despite its unpopularity with the mainstream on campus, they're willing to challenge the orthodoxies, the received opinions, with firmness,
Yeah.
right as God gives us to see the right, as Lincoln said. It's so easy to censor yourself, to hide, to stand back, to only think about, well, what's going to make me popular, what's going to enable me to get ahead, what's going to serve my career, and all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But I get these wonderful, brilliant students who will stand up and challenge the dominant orthodoxies because they believe that truth has priority over everything else. And that's what gives me hope.
That is a great answer.
Put it that way. They are what give me hope.
That's a great answer. And with that, thank you very much. All right. And that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. and subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.